in the footsteps of Jesus and the early church, the parable of the foundation. Jesus once told a parable about two builders. One built his house upon the rock, deep and solid. When the storms came, when the rains fell and the floods rose, and the winds beat against that house, it stood firm. The other built his house upon sand, quick and easy. And when the storms came to that house, it fell with a great crash. The point of the parable was about hearing Jesus' words and putting them into practice, about building your life on a foundation that will endure. But there's another way to think about foundations. The stories we've been exploring, the scrolls, the inscriptions, the tunnels and seals. These are foundations. They're the bedrock beneath the biblical narrative, the solid ground on which the accounts rest. They show us that the story didn't float in some mythical space, disconnected from the real world. It happened in actual places, in real time, among people whose names were recorded, not just in scripture, but in the administrative records of empires, on victory monuments, in burial inscriptions. And now we come to the center of the story, to the hinge point of history, as Christians understand it, to the life of Jesus of Nazareth, who walked on actual roads, taught in real synagogues, healed people in identifiable towns, and was crucified under a Roman prefect whose name appears on a stone inscription in Caesarea. And after his death and resurrection, his followers spread out across the Roman world, establishing communities in cities we can still visit, cities whose ancient streets and buildings archaeologists have uncovered. They appeared before officials whose existence is confirmed in historical records. They wrote letters to churches in places like Corinth and Ephesus, places where we can walk among the ruins and see the very world they inhabited. Let us walk now in those footsteps. Let us visit the places where Jesus lived and taught, where he healed and wept, where he died and rose. And let us follow the early believers as they carried his message across the ancient world, from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. The foundation is rock. The storms of time have beaten against it for 2,000 years, and still it stands. Nazareth, the village of his childhood. The Gospels tell us that Jesus grew up in Nazareth, a small village in Galilee. Matthew says that after the return from Egypt, Joseph went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Luke gives us more detail about the Annunciation in Nazareth, about Mary and Joseph living there, about Jesus growing up in that place. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man, Luke tells us, describing his childhood years in this Galilean village. For a long time, some skeptics questioned whether Nazareth even existed in the first century. It's not mentioned in the Old Testament, not mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus in his extensive catalogues of Galilean towns, not mentioned in the Talmud. Some argued it was a later invention, a village that grew up after Jesus' time and was retroactively made into his hometown. But archaeological excavations have settled the question. Nazareth was real, and it was inhabited during the 1st century AD. Excavations in the modern town of Nazareth have uncovered remains from the Roman period. Simple stone houses, typical of small Galilean villages, agricultural installations, olive presses, wine presses, grain storage pits, the kind of everyday infrastructure you'd expect in a rural farming community. These weren't grand buildings. There are no palaces, no large public structures from this period. Nazareth was small, insignificant, easily overlooked, which makes Nathanael's question in John's Gospel very understandable. Nazareth. Can anything good come from there? It was a backwater, a nowhere place, a tiny village in the hills of Galilee where people scraped out a living from the rocky soil, pressed olives for oil, and lived quiet lives far from the centers of power. And yet, this is where Jesus grew up, in these simple stone houses, among these agricultural workers, in this unremarkable village. Luke tells us that Joseph was a tekton, usually translated carpenter, though the word could also mean a general craftsman or builder, someone who worked with wood and stone. Imagine Jesus as a boy in Nazareth, learning to work with his hands in Joseph's workshop, helping with the harvest, playing in the narrow streets between the stone houses, growing up in obscurity, unknown. Just another village child in a forgotten corner of the Roman Empire. The archaeological remains are humble. Fragments of pottery, remains of walls, storage pits cut into bedrock. But they confirm the setting. Nazareth was there. It was small, it was rural, and it was real. From this unlikely place, from this nowhere village that even other Jews looked down on, came the one who would change the world. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, not in a palace, but in a peasant's house, not in Jerusalem, but in Nazareth. Capernaum, the synagogue where he taught. When Jesus began his public ministry, he didn't stay in Nazareth. In fact, Luke tells us that when he taught in the Nazareth synagogue and declared himself the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, the people were furious and tried to throw him off a cliff. After that, Jesus made Capernaum his base of operations. Matthew says, leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali. Capernaum was a fishing village on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was larger than Nazareth, more prosperous, located on a trade route. It had a customs post, which is where Matthew the tax collector worked before Jesus called him to follow. The Gospels frequently mention Jesus teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. Mark describes a healing there. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. For centuries, pilgrims and travelers knew the general location of Capernaum, but the exact site of the ancient village was lost. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Franciscan archaeologists began excavating the site, and they uncovered the remains of a large synagogue. The synagogue they found is impressive, built of white limestone in a style that was popular in the 3rd or 4th century AD. It has rows of columns, ornate carvings, and the distinctive layout of ancient synagogues with stone benches along the walls where people would sit facing inward. But here's what's fascinating. Beneath this later synagogue, archaeologists found the remains of an earlier structure, a synagogue built of black basalt stone, the local material available in the 1st century. This earlier synagogue's foundations lie directly beneath the later, more elaborate building. Many scholars believe this earlier basalt synagogue is the one where Jesus taught. The later community, wanting to honor the sacred site, built a new, grander synagogue directly on top of it, preserving the location. You can visit Capernaum today. You can walk among the ruins of the white limestone synagogue and look down through gaps in the floor to see the darker stones of the earlier building beneath. You can stand in the space where Jesus may have stood when he taught, when he healed, when he spoke with an authority that amazed the people. The synagogue faces Jerusalem, as traditional synagogues do. The Sea of Galilee is steps away, its waters lapping at the shore as they did 2,000 years ago. In the morning, when the light comes across the water, you can almost imagine fishing boats being pulled up onto the beach, fishermen calling to each other, and Jesus walking among them, calling Peter and Andrew, James and John, "Come, follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." Near the synagogue, archaeologists have also uncovered the remains of what they believe is Peter's house. Early Christian pilgrims mentioned a house church in Capernaum that was venerated as Peter's home, the place where Jesus stayed when he was in the town. Excavations revealed a house that was modified in the 1st century to serve as a meeting place, with evidence of Christian veneration going back to the earliest centuries. Mark's Gospel tells us, as soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. This house, this home of Simon Peter, was where Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, where he stayed during his time in Capernaum, where he taught and ate and rested between his journeys around Galilee. The remains are fragmentary now, just foundations and walls, but they speak of domestic life, of ordinary homes where extraordinary things happened, of fishing families who welcomed an itinerant rabbi into their homes and found their lives turned upside down. Jesus called Capernaum his own town. It was his home base during his Galilean ministry, and despite its later prominence in Christian memory, despite the pilgrims who came there and the churches built to commemorate it, the place itself remains humble. Stone ruins by the shore of a lake, the remains of simple houses, a synagogue foundation built of local basalt. This is where the kingdom of God was proclaimed, not in palaces or temples, but in a fishing village, in a small town synagogue, in Peter's house by the lake. The Jesus boat, a vessel of his time. In 1986, there was a drought in Israel. The water level of the Sea of Galilee dropped significantly, exposing parts of the shore that were normally underwater. Two brothers, Moshe and Yuval Lufan, who lived in a kibbutz on the shore, were walking along the exposed mud when they noticed something. It was the outline of a boat buried in the mud. They could see the ribs and planks of an ancient vessel emerging from the sediment. They contacted archaeologists, who immediately recognized the significance of the find. Over the course of 11 days and nights, working urgently because the water level was rising again, a team excavated the boat, encased it in a polyurethane shell to protect the fragile wood, and floated it to a conservation facility. The boat is about 27 feet long and 7.5 feet wide. It was built of multiple types of wood: cedar, oak, and pine, using mortise and tenon joints, a construction technique common in the ancient Mediterranean. Radiocarbon dating and analysis of the pottery found with the boat placed it in the 1st century AD, between about 100 BC and 70 AD. This is exactly the time of Jesus. This is exactly the type of boat that would have been used by Galilean fishermen during his ministry. The Gospels frequently mention Jesus traveling by boat on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" The boat that was found, now called the Jesus boat, or the Sea of Galilee boat, gives us a tangible connection to those stories. This is what the boats looked like. This is how big they were, how they were constructed, how they were used. It's not Jesus's boat, of course. There's no way to connect it to Jesus specifically, but it's a boat from his time, from his region, of his type. When you read about Jesus calming the storm, about him teaching from a boat while crowds gathered on the shore, about him appearing to the disciples after his resurrection while they were fishing, you can picture this boat. The vessel could hold about 15 people. It had a small deck area and space for rowing or sailing. The Sea of Galilee is prone to sudden storms, as the Gospels describe, when wind funnels down through the surrounding hills and whips the water into dangerous waves. The boat was carefully conserved, a process that took years. The waterlogged wood had to be slowly treated with special waxes to replace the water and prevent the wood from crumbling as it dried. Today, the boat is displayed in a climate-controlled museum at Kibbutz Ginosar, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, not far from where it was found. You can stand and look at it, this ancient fishing vessel that plied the same waters where Jesus and his disciples sailed. You can see the simple, sturdy construction. You can imagine it loaded with nets and fish, with fishermen calling out to each other, with waves slapping against its hull. And maybe, if you close your eyes, you can imagine another boat on those waters, with a rabbi from Nazareth sleeping in the stern on a cushion while a storm rages, until he wakes and speaks to the wind and waves. Quiet. Be still. The boat is silent now, preserved behind glass, but it connects us to that world, to those waters, to the everyday life of Galilean fishermen who became the first followers of Jesus. The seat of Moses, authority in the synagogue. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23, Jesus criticizes the scribes and Pharisees, but the way he begins is interesting. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Moses' seat. For a long time, scholars weren't sure if this was a literal reference or a metaphorical way of describing teaching authority in the synagogue. Was there actually a physical seat of Moses? Then archaeologists began finding them. In several ancient synagogues in the Galilee region and beyond, they discovered stone chairs, ornately carved, placed in a position of honor in the synagogue. These are called seats of Moses, or Moses chairs. And they were apparently reserved for the teacher or reader of the law. One of the most well-preserved examples was found in the ancient synagogue at Chorazin, a town mentioned in the Gospels. Jesus pronounced woe upon Chorazin. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. The synagogue at Chorazin, built of black basalt stone, contains a carved stone seat positioned prominently in the building. The chair is decorated with a rosette pattern, and an Aramaic inscription on it indicates it was donated by someone named Udin, son of Ishmael, for a blessing. This is the seat of Moses, a physical chair where the teacher would sit to expound the law, to read from the Torah scroll, to teach the congregation. Jesus' reference to the Pharisees sitting in Moses' seat wasn't just a metaphor. He was referring to an actual practice, an actual piece of synagogue furniture. When Jesus taught in synagogues, he would have stood or sat in such a seat. Luke tells us about Jesus teaching in Nazareth. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue. As was his custom, he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. The scroll would have been kept in an ark, a special cabinet. The reader would take it, stand or sit in the seat of Moses, unroll it, and read. Then he might sit to teach, explaining and applying the text. Jesus did this in synagogues throughout Galilee, standing in these seats of authority, reading the scriptures, teaching the crowds. And what amazed people was that he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. The teachers of the law cited other rabbis, other traditions. Rabbi Hillel says this. Rabbi Shammai says that. They located their authority in the chain of tradition. But Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, but I tell you." He spoke with direct, personal authority that both attracted and disturbed his listeners. The stone seats remain in the ruined synagogues of Galilee. Simple chairs carved from basalt, weathered by centuries. But they remind us of the setting of Jesus' teaching ministry, of the customs and practices of first-century Judaism, of the physical reality of the world described in the Gospels. Jericho, ancient walls and Bronze Age mysteries. Jericho holds a special place in biblical archaeology because it's one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. The tale of ancient Jericho, located near modern Jericho in the West Bank, contains layers of habitation going back thousands of years. The biblical story of Jericho is dramatic. In the book of Joshua, the Israelites, newly arrived in the Promised Land after 40 years of wilderness wandering, encounter Jericho as a heavily fortified city blocking their path. God commands them to march around the city once a day for 6 days, then 7 times on the 7th day. When they do, and when the priests blow their trumpets and the people shout, the walls of Jericho collapse and the city falls. It's one of the most famous miracle stories in the Bible. But what does archaeology tell us about Jericho? The site of ancient Jericho has been extensively excavated, beginning with major digs in the 1950s by Kathleen Kenyon, and continuing with various excavations since then. What they found is a complex, multi-layered site with evidence of habitation and destruction across many different periods. There are indeed remains of massive fortification walls at Jericho, thick stone walls, defensive towers, evidence of a heavily fortified city in the Bronze Age. And there is evidence of violent destruction, burned layers, collapsed structures. The challenge is dating these destruction layers precisely and matching them to the biblical time frame. Archaeological dating in this period is complex and sometimes controversial. Different archaeologists have proposed different dates for the various destruction levels at Jericho. Some archaeologists believe they've found evidence of destruction in the late Bronze Age that could correspond to the time period associated with Joshua's conquest around the 15th or 13th century BC, depending on which chronology you follow. They point to collapsed walls, evidence of fire, and other signs of violent destruction. Others are more skeptical, arguing that the evidence is inconclusive or that the destruction layers don't match the biblical time frame precisely. What's not in dispute is that Jericho was an ancient, heavily fortified city. The archaeological remains confirm the basic setting described in Joshua: a walled city, a significant defensive position, a place that would have been a major obstacle for any invading force. Walking through the excavations at Jericho is like walking through a layer cake of history. You can see remains from different periods stacked on top of each other. Neolithic towers from 8000 BC, some of the oldest stone architecture in the world, Bronze Age walls and houses, evidence of repeated habitation, destruction, and rebuilding across millennia. The site is hot, dusty, below sea level, near the Dead Sea. It's an oasis in the desert, made possible by a spring. The same spring that Elisha healed according to 2 Kings, when the people complained that the water was bad and the land was unproductive. Whether archaeology has definitively proven the miraculous collapse of Jericho's walls, as described in Joshua, is debated. But it has confirmed that Jericho was an ancient, fortified city, that it experienced violent destruction in antiquity, and that the biblical description of it as a walled city blocking the entrance to Canaan is historically accurate. The tell stands there still, a mound of earth and stone containing the layers of countless human lives, countless stories, countless risings and fallings. And somewhere in those layers, preserved in the archaeological record, is the memory of a city that once stood strong and then fell. The Pool of Bethesda, 5 porticos by the sheep gate. The Gospel of John describes Jesus healing a paralyzed man at a pool in Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. For a long time, the details of this description puzzled scholars. A pool with 5 porticos? How does that work architecturally? 4 porticos surrounding a rectangular pool makes sense, but 5? In the 19th century, archaeologists began excavating in the area north of the Temple Mount, near what had traditionally been identified as the sheep gate mentioned in Nehemiah. And they discovered something remarkable: a double pool complex. 2 large rectangular pools side by side, separated by a wall or partition, with porticos, covered walkways supported by columns, on all 4 sides, and one running down the middle between the 2 pools. 5 porticos, exactly as John described. The pools were part of a complex water system, fed by rain and possibly by a spring. In the 2nd century AD, the Romans built a healing shrine there, dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing, incorporating the earlier pools. But the pools themselves date back to the 2nd Temple period, the time of Jesus. John's Gospel is often the most theological, the most interpretive of the 4 Gospels. Sometimes its geographical and architectural details have been dismissed as symbolic rather than literal. But here, in a small detail about 5 porticos, John's Gospel shows precise, accurate knowledge of the topography of Jerusalem. The healing story itself is poignant. Jesus encounters a man who has been an invalid for 38 years, lying by the pool. According to local belief, an angel would occasionally stir the water, and whoever stepped in first after the stirring would be healed. The paralyzed man tells Jesus, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Imagine 38 years of hoping, of watching others step into the water while you remain helpless. 38 years of disappointment. Jesus asks him, "Do you want to get well?" And when the man explains his situation, Jesus simply says, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And the man does. After 38 years of paralysis, he stands, picks up his mat, and walks. The pool is still there, or at least its remains are. You can visit the site, now within the grounds of the Church of St. Anne, in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem's Old City. You can look down at the excavated pools, the ancient stones, the columns from the later Roman shrine. You can imagine the porticos filled with sick people, desperate people, hoping people. And you can imagine Jesus walking among them, seeing the one man whom everyone else overlooked after so many years, and speaking the word that changed everything: "Get up." The trumpeting place, announcing the Sabbath. In the 1960s, during excavations near the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, archaeologists found a stone block that had clearly fallen from the top of the Temple Mount walls during the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The stone bears a partial Hebrew inscription, "To the place of trumpeting." This small inscription opened a window into the daily rhythms of temple worship. The Mishnah, the collection of Jewish oral traditions compiled around 200 AD, describes how priests would blow trumpets from the top of the temple walls to announce the beginning and end of the Sabbath. The trumpet blast would signal to the people of Jerusalem that the Sabbath was beginning, that it was time to stop work, to light the Sabbath lamps, to prepare for the day of rest. And another trumpet blast would mark the end of the Sabbath. This stone, with its fragmentary inscription, likely marked the specific spot on the temple wall where the priest would stand to blow these trumpets. It fell when the Romans destroyed the temple, crashing down to the street below, where it lay for 19 centuries until archaeologists uncovered it. The stone is small, just a fragment, but it speaks of the living rhythms of Jewish life in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. The trumpet calls that marked the passage of time, that called people to worship, that structured the week around the Sabbath rest. Jesus would have heard these trumpets. Growing up, visiting Jerusalem for the festivals, walking in the temple courts, the blast of the shofar calling the city to Sabbath rest would have been a familiar sound, part of the texture of Jewish life. And now, silent in a museum, this stone remembers. It remembers the trumpets. It remembers the priests standing on the wall. It remembers the temple in all its glory before the Romans came with fire and destruction to the place of trumpeting, where now there is only silence and memory and stone. Herod's temple, massive stones and grand architecture. The temple that Jesus knew, the temple where he taught and overturned the money changers' tables, was not Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. When the exiles returned under Ezra and Nehemiah, they built a second temple. But it was modest compared to Solomon's glorious structure. Then came Herod the Great. He was a complicated figure, brutal, paranoid, responsible for terrible atrocities, including the massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem. But he was also a master builder who left behind some of the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient world. Around 20 BC, Herod began a massive expansion and renovation of the temple in Jerusalem. He didn't just repair it, he transformed it. He expanded the Temple Mount platform to create a vast courtyard. He built massive retaining walls to support this expanded platform. He clad the temple building itself in white stone and gold, making it a structure of dazzling beauty. The Gospels record the disciples' reaction when they looked at the temple. "Teacher, look what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." Mark 13:1. And indeed, the stones were massive. Some of the stones in the retaining walls weigh over 100 tons. They're cut with incredible precision, fitted together so tightly that you can't slip a piece of paper between them. These stones still exist. The Western Wall, also called the Wailing Wall, is a portion of the retaining wall that Herod built. It's been a place of Jewish prayer for centuries, and you can still see the characteristic Herodian masonry. Large ashlar stones with smooth faces and recessed borders. When you stand before the Western Wall today, you're looking at construction from Herod's time, from the period when Jesus lived. These are the stones that the disciples marveled at. This is the Temple Mount that Jesus walked on. Jesus' prophecy about the temple was devastating. Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Mark 13:2. And in 70 AD it happened. The Romans under Titus besieged Jerusalem during the Jewish revolt. They broke through the walls, slaughtered the inhabitants, and set fire to the temple. The gold decorations melted in the heat, and soldiers pried apart the stones to get at it. The magnificent structure that had taken decades to build was reduced to ruins in a matter of days. But the retaining walls, the massive foundation stones, those remained. They were too large, too heavy, too deep to be easily moved or destroyed. And so they endure, a testament to Herod's ambition and to the reality of the temple that Jesus knew. Archeological excavations around the Temple Mount have uncovered the streets that ran alongside these walls, still paved with their ancient stones. In some places, you can still see the stones that fell from the top of the wall during the destruction, lying where they crashed to the pavement below, so massive that no one ever bothered to move them. The temple itself is gone. Only the platform remains, now topped by the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the stones speak of what once was, of courts filled with worshippers, of priests offering sacrifices, of Jesus teaching in the porticos, challenging the religious authorities, predicting both the temple's destruction and his own resurrection. The Gallio inscription, dating Paul's ministry. The book of Acts tells us about Paul's missionary journeys throughout the Roman Empire. In chapter 18, we read about his time in Corinth. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. The passage goes on to describe how the Jews accused Paul of persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. But Gallio refused to hear the case. If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. This Gallio, mentioned in passing in Acts, turns out to be a key figure for dating Paul's ministry, because we have external evidence about when Gallio served as proconsul of Achaia. In the Greek city of Delphi, famous in ancient times for its oracle, archaeologists discovered a stone inscription. It's a letter from the Emperor Claudius, dated to his 26th acclamation as emperor, which corresponds to the year 51 to 52 AD. And in this letter, Claudius mentions Gallio, referring to him as Lucius Junius Gallio, my friend, and the proconsul of Achaia. This inscription allows us to date Gallio's proconsulship to around 51 to 52 AD. Roman proconsuls typically served for 1 or 2 years. So Gallio was in office in Corinth during this narrow window of time. And since Acts tells us Paul appeared before Gallio in Corinth, we can date Paul's stay in Corinth to this same period. This becomes an anchor point for dating Paul's missionary journeys, his letters, and the early spread of Christianity. It's remarkable how a casual mention of a Roman official in Acts, someone who wasn't even interested in Paul's case and dismissed it out of hand, becomes a crucial piece of historical evidence. Luke, the author of Acts, was carefully noting real people, real places, real chronologies, and archaeology confirms it. Gallio himself is also mentioned by other ancient writers. He was the brother of the famous philosopher Seneca, who served as tutor and advisor to Emperor Nero. Seneca wrote affectionately about his brother Gallio, describing him as a man of exceptional character. So Paul appeared before this Gallio, this Roman official who was known for his fairness and good character, in Corinth in 51 to 52 AD, and Gallio, seeing the dispute as an internal Jewish religious matter, refused to judge it. This decision, ironically, protected Paul and allowed his ministry to continue. The inscription from Delphi is fragmentary, broken into several pieces, but those fragments preserve just enough text to identify Gallio and date his proconsulship. And in doing so, they anchor the book of Acts firmly in history. The Erastus inscription, a Christian in Corinth. Paul's letter to the Romans, written from Corinth, ends with greetings from various people. In Romans 16:23, Paul writes, "Erastus, who is the city's director of public works, and our brother Quartus, send you their greetings." Erastus is described as the oikonomos of the city, a term that could mean treasurer, director of public works, or a similar administrative official. He was someone of some standing in Corinth, a Christian who held public office. In 1929, archaeologists excavating in Corinth uncovered a paved plaza near the theatre. Set into the pavement was a Latin inscription. Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid the pavement at his own expense. An aedile in Roman government was a civic official responsible for public works, festivals, and maintaining public buildings. Essentially what we'd call a director of public works or city manager. And here was an inscription about an Erastus who held exactly that position in Corinth and who paid for public construction, as was customary for wealthy officials. The inscription is dated to the mid-1st century AD, based on the style of the lettering and the archaeological context. This is exactly the right time and place for Paul's Erastus. Now, Erastus was not an uncommon name in the Roman world, so we can't be absolutely certain this is the same person, but the coincidence is striking. The same name, the same city, the same position, the same time period. Most scholars believe this is very likely the same Erastus mentioned by Paul. If so, it gives us a glimpse into the early Christian community in Corinth. It wasn't just slaves and poor people who became Christians, though they were certainly part of the community. There were also people of means and position, like Erastus, who used their resources and influence to support the church and the work of people like Paul. The inscription is still there, set into the pavement in ancient Corinth. You can visit the archaeological site and see it, weathered but still legible. This greeting from a first-century Christian preserved in stone. Erastus, send you his greetings, Paul wrote, and Erastus left his own greeting in the pavement of his city, a public work dedicated at his own expense, a testament to his position and perhaps to his faith. The Bema in Corinth, the judgment seat. Acts 18 tells us that when the Jews brought Paul before Gallio in Corinth, they brought him to the place of judgment. The Greek word is bema, which means a raised platform or judgment seat. In the Roman Forum of Corinth, archaeologists have uncovered the bema, the official judgment seat where the Roman proconsul would sit to hear legal cases and make official pronouncements. It's a raised stone platform, accessed by steps, positioned prominently in the public square. This is where Paul would have stood before Gallio. He would have climbed the steps or stood in front of the platform while his accusers made their case. Gallio would have been seated on the bema, elevated above the crowd, in the position of authority. Acts tells us that when Gallio refused to hear the case and drove them away from the bema, the crowd seized Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the court. But Gallio showed no concern whatever. The bema still stands in Corinth, among the ruins of the ancient Forum. You can walk up to it, touch the weathered stones, stand where Paul stood. The Forum around it would have been busy with commerce and legal proceedings, the center of civic life in this prosperous Roman colony. Paul knew about bemas, about judgment seats. Later, when he wrote to the Corinthians, he used the image. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. 2 Corinthians 5:10. He had stood before an earthly bema, before Gallio's judgment seat, and he spoke of a greater judgment seat, where all would stand before Christ. The earthly bema was just a shadow, a temporary platform of stone and authority, but it served as a powerful image for the ultimate judgment to come. Sergius Paulus, the proconsul of Cyprus. In Acts 13, we read about Paul and Barnabas's first missionary journey. They travelled to the island of Cyprus, and there they encountered the Roman proconsul. They travelled through the whole island until they came to Paphos. There they met a Jewish sorcerer and false prophet named Bar-Joses, who was an attendant of the proconsul, Sergius Paulus. The proconsul, an intelligent man, sent for Barnabas and Saul because he wanted to hear the word of God. The story continues with Paul confronting the sorcerer Elymas, who was trying to turn the proconsul away from the faith. Paul struck Elymas with temporary blindness, and when the proconsul saw what had happened, he believed, for he was amazed at the teaching about the Lord. For a long time, this Sergius Paulus was known only from Acts, but archaeological and literary evidence has surfaced confirming that a man named Sergius Paulus, or Paulus, was indeed active in the region during this period. Inscriptions from Cyprus mention officials with these names. An inscription from the Roman period refers to a Paulus as proconsul. Additionally, inscriptions from Pisidian Antioch in Asia Minor mention a Sergius Paulus, and some scholars believe this may be the same person or a close relative, suggesting the family had connections to that region. Furthermore, the Roman historian Pliny the Elder mentions a Sergius Paulus as an authority on natural history, indicating there was indeed a Roman official of some standing was this name in the 1st century. The identification isn't certain. Roman names can be tricky, and there could have been multiple men with similar names. But the evidence suggests that Luke's account in Acts is, once again, historically grounded. There was a proconsul in Cyprus named Sergius Paulus at roughly the right time, just as Acts describes. What's remarkable about this story is that it represents one of the few instances in Acts where a high-ranking Roman official is said to have become a believer. Most of Paul's converts were ordinary people, artisans, merchants, household slaves. But here was a proconsul, a man of considerable power and education, who wanted to hear the word of God and believed after witnessing Paul's confrontation with the sorcerer. The inscriptions don't tell us about his conversion, of course. They're simply administrative records, noting his position and perhaps his achievements. But they confirm that Luke knew what he was talking about when he described Paul and Barnabas encountering this official in Cyprus. Evidence of crucifixion, the heel bone. In 1968, construction workers in northeast Jerusalem accidentally discovered an ancient Jewish tomb. Inside were several ossuaries containing the bones of Jewish individuals from the 1st century AD. One of these ossuaries contained the bones of a man, and something extraordinary was immediately visible. His right heel bone had an iron nail driven through it. The nail was still in place, bent at the point where it had struck a knot in the wood of the cross, and couldn't be extracted. This was the first, and to this day, the only direct archaeological evidence of Roman crucifixion that has ever been found. The nail had been driven through the heel, probably after the man's feet had been positioned on either side of the wooden upright of the cross. The nail would have fixed his feet to the cross in an agonizing position. An inscription on the ossuary identified the victim as Yehohanan, son of Hokol, a Jewish man who lived in the 1st century and died by crucifixion. The discovery was scientifically analyzed and published, confirming what the literary sources had always told us, but what had never before been physically demonstrated. The Romans practiced crucifixion exactly as described in ancient texts, including the Gospels. Crucifixion was a form of execution designed to maximize suffering and humiliation. The victim was affixed to a cross with nails or ropes and left to die slowly from exhaustion, asphyxiation, and shock. It was used by the Romans primarily for slaves, rebels, and the lowest criminals. It was considered so degrading that Roman citizens were exempt from it, except in cases of treason. The Gospels describe Jesus' crucifixion in relatively sparse detail, but what details they give match what we know from other sources and from this archaeological evidence. The nailing through the hands or wrists and feet, the slow death, the soldiers breaking the legs of the crucified to hasten death by preventing them from pushing up to breathe. Looking at that heel bone, with a nail still driven through it, brings the reality of crucifixion into stark, horrible focus. This is what it meant. This is what they did. This is the death that Jesus died. The ossuary and its contents were eventually reburied according to Jewish law, but not before they has been thoroughly documented. The evidence remains in photographs and scientific reports. An iron nail through a heel bone, silent testimony to one of the cruelest forms of execution ever devised, and to the historical reality of what happened on a hill outside Jerusalem one Friday afternoon when Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate. The Garden Tomb and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Gospels tell us that Jesus was buried in a tomb in a garden near the place of crucifixion. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who was secretly a disciple of Jesus, asked Pilate for Jesus' body and laid it in his own new tomb, cut out of the rock. Where was this tomb? Two main sites in Jerusalem have been proposed. The first is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the old city of Jerusalem. This has been the traditional site since the 4th century AD, when Queen Helena, mother of Emperor Constantine, visited Jerusalem and identified various holy sites. The church is an enormous, ancient structure that has been rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. At first glance, it seems an unlikely location. It's inside the current old city walls, and Jesus was crucified outside the city. But archaeology has revealed that in the 1st century, this area was indeed outside the city walls. The walls were expanded later to include this area, but in Jesus' time, it was outside, fitting the gospel accounts. Excavations beneath the church have revealed evidence of an ancient quarry and rock-cut tombs from the 1st century. In ancient times, cemeteries were located outside city walls, often in old quarries. This fits the description of a garden area with tombs nearby. The second site is the Garden Tomb, a peaceful garden area north of the old city, with a rock-cut tomb that dates to the 1st temple period, much earlier than Jesus. This site became popular in the 19th century as an alternative to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which many Protestant visitors found too ornate and overlaid with later tradition. The Garden Tomb is serene and beautiful, easier to imagine as the garden described in the Gospels. But archaeologically, the tomb is too old, dating to the 7th or 8th century BC rather than the 1st century AD. Most scholars believe it cannot be the actual tomb of Jesus. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, despite its heavy later construction and the difficulty of excavating beneath an active church, has better archaeological credentials. The tradition identifying it as the site goes back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. The underlying geology and archaeology fit the gospel descriptions. But here's the truth. We cannot know with certainty where Jesus was buried. What we can know is that the type of tomb described in the Gospels, a rock-cut tomb with a rolling stone, matches the kind of tombs that wealthy Jews used in 1st century Jerusalem. Archaeologists have found many such tombs in the area around Jerusalem. These tombs typically had a low entrance that you had to stoop to enter, Inside, there would be benches or niches cut into the rock where bodies could be laid. After the flesh decomposed, the bones would be collected and placed in an ossuary, a stone bone box. The entrance would be sealed with a large round stone that rolled in a groove, like a wheel. The Gospels describe the women coming to the tomb early on Sunday morning and finding the stone rolled away. They describe Peter and John running to the tomb and stooping to look inside. They describe angels or a young man sitting inside the tomb. All of these details fit the architecture of first-century Jewish tombs. Whether the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or some other location is the actual site, the archaeological evidence confirms that the Gospel descriptions are accurate for the time and place. The tomb existed, or one just like it existed, in the Jerusalem of Jesus' day. And on the third day, according to the testimony of the witnesses, it was empty. Early Christian inscriptions, the spreading faith. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, in the decades and centuries after Jesus' death, believers began to leave their mark. Sometimes these marks are obvious. Churches, large inscriptions, public declarations of faith. But often, they're subtle. A symbol scratched on a wall, a name in a catacomb, an inscription on a tombstone. Some of the earliest Christian inscriptions come from the catacombs of Rome, the underground burial chambers, where Christians and others buried their dead. These dark tunnels, carved through the soft tufa rock beneath Rome, contain thousands of burial niches. And on the walls, scratched or painted, are symbols and phrases. The fish symbol, the Greek letters ichthys, ichthys, which spell fish, but also form an acronym for Jesus Christ, God's Son, Saviour. The Chi symbol, the first two letters of Christ in Greek, overlaid to form a distinctive monogram. Anchors, representing hope. Doves, representing the Holy Spirit. And simple phrases. In peace, with the saints. He lives in God. These aren't elaborate or formal. They're personal expressions of faith, left by ordinary believers or their family members. A way of saying, here lies a Christian. Here lies someone who believed in Jesus Christ and hoped in the resurrection. In other parts of the Roman world, similar inscriptions appear. In Pompeii, the city buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, there's a cryptic square of letters called the Sator Square that some scholars believe may be an early Christian cryptogram, though this is debated. More clearly, by the 2nd century, we find gravestones and inscriptions that openly mention Christ or identify the deceased as Christians. The Abercius inscription from Phrygia, modern Turkey, dated to the late 2nd century, is a funerary inscription that uses veiled Christian language to describe the deceased bishop's travels and faith. These inscriptions, scattered across the Roman Empire, trace the spread of early Christianity, from Jerusalem to Rome, from Antioch to Alexandria, from the cities of Asia Minor to the far reaches of the empire. Believers were proclaiming their faith, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly, depending on the political climate. They remind us that Christianity didn't spread through grand public campaigns initially. It spread through personal witness, through small communities gathering in homes, through inscriptions left in tombs, through symbols recognized by fellow believers. The fish scratched on a wall, the anchor carved on a gravestone. The simple statement, "In Christ," added to a burial inscription. These were acts of faith and hope, proclamations that death was not the end, affirmations that Christ had conquered the grave. And they spread, these small marks of faith, across the ancient world, until eventually Christianity moved from the catacombs to the throne rooms, from persecuted minority to official religion of the empire. But in the beginning, it was just people, ordinary people who believed an extraordinary message. And they left their marks in stone and paint, in the darkness beneath the earth, whispering across the centuries. We believed, we hoped, we knew Christ, and we're waiting for the resurrection. Miriam, daughter of Yeshua, the high priestly family. In the 1990s, archaeologists uncovered a family tomb in the Valley of Elah, the same valley where David fought Goliath centuries earlier. Inside were several ossuaries, and one of them bore an inscription, Miriam, daughter of Yeshua, son of Caiaphas. This inscription links back to the high priestly family of Caiaphas, the same Caiaphas who presided over Jesus' trial. Yeshua, Jesus in Greek, son of Caiaphas, would have been a member of this prominent priestly family. And this ossuary contained the bones of his daughter Miriam. It's a reminder that the people mentioned in the Gospels had families, descendants, lives that continued after the events of the Passion. Caiaphas condemned Jesus, but he also had children and grandchildren. His family continued, prominent in Jerusalem, until the city's destruction in 70 AD. The ossuary is simple but well made, typical of wealthy Jewish burials of the period. The inscription is in Aramaic, the common language of the time, and it preserves a family connection to one of the key figures in the gospel narrative. House architecture in Galilee. The world Jesus knew. Throughout Galilee, archaeologists have excavated numerous first-century villages and towns, and what they've found is remarkably consistent. Simple stone houses, usually built around a central courtyard that might be shared by an extended family. The houses had stone walls with mud and thatch roofs supported by wooden beams. The roofs were flat and accessible by an outside staircase, making them useful as additional living space, especially in hot weather. This explains the story in Mark 2, where 4 men carrying a paralyzed friend couldn't get through the crowd to reach Jesus, so they went up on the roof, dug through it, and lowered their friend down on his mat. With a mud and thatch roof, this would have been entirely possible. Messy, certainly. Debris would have fallen on those below. But possible. The Gospel account isn't describing something fantastical. It's describing something that made perfect sense in the context of first-century Galilean architecture. The houses were small, usually just 1 or 2 rooms on the ground floor, with a flat roof providing additional space. Animals might be kept in part of the ground floor during winter. Cooking was often done in the courtyard. Storage jars, grinding stones, olive presses, and other everyday items have been found in these excavations. This was the world Jesus grew up in. Simple stone houses, shared courtyards where neighbors and family members would interact daily, grinding grain by hand, pressing olives for oil, drawing water from the village well. A life lived close to the earth, close to community, without much privacy or luxury. When Jesus taught about everyday life, about sweeping a house to find a lost coin, about a woman needing bread, about children playing in the marketplace, he was describing the world his hearers knew intimately. And archaeology has recovered that world, showing us the physical setting of his parables and teachings. The spread of the gospel from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. The book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome, under house arrest, but still preaching boldly and without hindrance. The story of early Christianity doesn't end there, of course. It was just beginning. Within a few centuries, Christian communities existed throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. Archaeological evidence traces this spread. Church buildings appear first as modified houses, house churches, then as purpose-built structures. Christian symbols appear on lamps, pottery, jewelry. Christian burial practices become identifiable in the archaeological record. In Rome itself, the catacombs expanded to accommodate thousands of Christian burials. In cities across the empire, Christian communities grew and organized. Bishops emerged as leaders. Creeds were formulated. Scriptures were copied and distributed. And through it all, persecution came in waves, sometimes local, sometimes empire-wide. Christians were accused of atheism because they refused to worship the Roman gods. They were accused of disloyalty because they wouldn't participate in emperor worship. They were scapegoated for disasters. Nero blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Yet the church grew. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, wrote Tertullian in the late 2nd century. And it was true. The willingness of Christians to die for their faith, the courage they showed in the face of persecution, attracted converts. By the 4th century, Christianity had grown from a small Jewish sect to a major religious movement across the empire. The Emperor Constantine converted and issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, granting religious tolerance to Christians. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Theodosius. The archaeological record traces this transformation, from secret symbols in catacombs to grand basilicas, from house churches to massive cathedrals, from a persecuted minority to the dominant religion of the Western world. And it all started in a small village in Galilee, with a rabbi who taught in synagogues and healed the sick, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, buried in a rock-cut tomb, and proclaimed risen on the 3rd day by witnesses who were willing to die rather than deny what they claimed to have seen. 53 confirmed names. The historical bedrock. Scholars have documented that at least 53 individuals mentioned in the Old Testament have been confirmed in archaeological records from their own time period. Kings, officials, priests, people whose names appear both in the Bible and in ancient inscriptions, seals, or other contemporary documents. These include major figures like David, whose dynasty is mentioned in the Tel Dan inscription, Hezekiah, whose seal we discussed, Jehoiakim, the king taken captive to Babylon, whose name appears in Babylonian ration records, Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, who led the return from exile, mentioned in Persian period documents. But they also include lesser-known officials and scribes. Gemariah, son of Shaphan, mentioned in Jeremiah, whose seal impression was found in Jerusalem. Azariah, son of Hilkiah, another high official whose seal has been discovered. This level of confirmation is extraordinary for ancient texts. The biblical writers weren't inventing names out of thin air. They were recording real people who held real positions in real government. And the archaeological record confirms it, name after name. This doesn't prove every detail of every biblical story. Archeology can't do that, but it does establish that the biblical texts are historically grounded, that they are working with real names and real historical frameworks, not creating fictional worlds. The Bible describes a real world, real cities, real kings, real events, and the stones bear witness to it. Conclusion: walking where they walked. We've journeyed now through the archaeological landscape of the New Testament world, from the small village of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, to the fishing villages of Galilee, where he called his first disciples, from the synagogues where he taught to the pool where he healed, from the temple in Jerusalem where he taught and predicted its destruction to the judgment seat, where he was tried before Pilate. We've followed the early church as it spread from Jerusalem to the far corners of the Roman Empire. We've seen the inscriptions, the buildings, the everyday objects that connect us to that world. We've traced the names of officials mentioned in Acts and found them confirmed in archaeological records. We've looked at early Christian symbols and inscriptions that show the spread and growth of the faith. And through it all, we've seen a consistent pattern. The gospel accounts are historically grounded. They describe real places, real people, real events in a real historical context. This doesn't make the supernatural claims easier to accept for everyone. You can visit the pool of Siloam and still debate whether Jesus actually healed anyone there. You can see first-century fishing boats and still question whether Jesus walked on water. But what you can't reasonably question anymore is whether the setting is real, whether the people existed, whether the world described in the Gospels and Acts is historical or fictional. It's historical. The stones prove it. The inscriptions confirm it. The archaeological remains demonstrate it beyond reasonable doubt. You can walk today where Jesus walked. You can stand in the ruins of Capernaum where he taught. You can see the pool of Siloam where he sent the blind man to wash. You can touch the stones of Herod's Temple Mount where he overturned the money changers' tables. You can visit Corinth and see the Bema where Paul stood before Gallio. These aren't just stories. They're memories preserved in stone and earth, waiting to be uncovered. They're the physical residue of lives lived, of words spoken, of events that changed the world. And in some mysterious way, walking in those places, touching those stones, Seeing those ruins, it brings the stories to life. It makes them tangible. It connects us across 2,000 years to the people who walked there first. The woman who touched Jesus' cloak in the crowd. The paralyzed man lowered through the roof. The blind man washing in the pool. The disciples in their fishing boat. Paul arguing in the marketplace. The early believers scratching a fish symbol on a catacomb wall. They were real. They lived in this world, this historical world that archaeology has recovered and documented. They walked on these stones, drew water from these pools, worshipped in these synagogues, sailed on these waters. And their testimony, their witness, their proclamation of what they experienced, it echoes still, not just in the texts preserved through the centuries, but in the very landscape where it happened. The stones cry out. The earth remembers. In Galilee, the sun still rises over the sea, painting the water gold and pink. In Jerusalem, the stones of the western wall still stand, massive and enduring. In Corinth, you can still walk the ancient streets where Paul walked. In Rome, you can still descend into the catacombs where early Christians buried their dead and proclaimed their hope. The world has changed in countless ways since the first century. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have transformed human life beyond anything those ancient people could have imagined. Languages have evolved. Cultures have shifted. The landscape itself has changed. But the stones remain. The foundations endure. The archaeological record preserves fragments of that world, pieces of the puzzle that help us see more clearly what happened, where it happened, how it happened. And at the center of it all is a man from Nazareth, a rabbi who taught with authority, who healed the sick and welcomed the outcasts, who challenged the powerful and comforted the broken, who was crucified and buried and proclaimed risen. The archaeology can take us to his world. It can show us his hometown, the villages where he taught, the city where he died. It can confirm the setting, verify the names, establish the historical framework. But it cannot make us believe. That remains a matter of the heart, of faith, of personal encounter with the risen Christ who still meets people today, just as he met Mary in the garden on that first Easter morning. The stones bear witness. They tell us the story is grounded in history, rooted in reality, connected to the actual world of the ancient Near East. And then they leave us with the question, what will you do with this Jesus who lived in this world, who died under Pontius Pilate, whom witnesses proclaimed risen from the dead? The stones have spoken. The archaeological record has testified. The rest is between you and the one who walked on these stones, taught in these synagogues, healed at these pools, and conquered death in a garden tomb near Jerusalem. Rest now in the knowledge that the foundation is solid, that the story is real, that 2,000 years of history, of archaeological discovery, of scholarly investigation have not disproven it, but confirmed it, layer by layer, stone by stone, inscription by inscription. The sun sets over Galilee. The stones sleep in silence, and the story endures, passed from generation to generation, testified to by witnesses, ancient and modern, confirmed by evidence both written and dug from the earth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He dwelt among us in a real place, in a real time, in this world that archaeology has uncovered and documented. The Word became flesh and walked on these stones, and the stones remember.